Hello and welcome. This is a lecture review for the William Stallings Effective Cybersecurity First Edition book. Again, this is a lecture review using the material offered by the publisher Pearson VUE. All copyrights belong to them. This is for educational purposes only. Again, the textbook is Stallings Effective Cybersecurity, a guide to using best practices and standards, first edition, done through Pearson VUE Education, ISBN number 13 97801 3477 2806. So again, copyright belongs to the author and publisher. I am just doing lecture reviews on the PowerPoints for each of the individual chapters. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in. Alright, Chapter 6 is about information management. This is going to be the areas that we're going to be looking at for information security forums, for standard of good practices. Those are going to be the SGPs, and they're going to encompass 4 main areas. Those areas for this chapter are things like information classification handling. That's going to be dealing with the methods of classifying and protecting the organization's informational assets. We also have privacy, and that is a concern with threats, controls, policies related to the privacy of personal identifiable information, PII. The third area is document and records management, and this area is concerned with the protection and handling of documents and record maintenance for organizations. Lastly is the sensitive physical information. This will cover specific issues related to security of information assets in the physical form. So those are the 4 main areas of information management in this chapter. So let's jump in and get started. Alright, so again, that first area is information classification and handling. That is looking at the individual objects and then classifying them and categorizing them correctly. All information assets have to be classified according to their sensitivity, their importance, their impact to the organization. You're also going to be looking at labeling and handling of those assets. For example, I may have a record of an individual that has PII in it. Well, we're going to classify and we're going to label that document accordingly. So according to ISO 27001, part of the IS management system requirements are putting all 3 of these requirements under security controls. So again, classification, and that's the scheme that should be taken into account: the legal requirements, the value, the criticality, and the sensitive of unauthorized disclosure or modification of said object. Second, labeling of information, and that's how the organization develops and implements an appropriate set of procedures for information labeling in accordance to the classification scheme. So classification scheme is first, then labeling. Lastly is handling, and that's the policies and procedures, including guidelines for handling assets that should be developed and implemented in accordance with both the classification and labeling scheme. These basically allow us to outline how we're going to handle specific pieces of information accordingly. So here is a general guideline. So step 1 is to categorize the information systems, and you're going to notice we're going to be using a FIPS 199 as part of the SP 860 NIST standard. So again, that's the categorization. Maybe we categorize them into level 1, 2, and 3, or we may say secret, top secret, need to know. It really just depends. After that, we select the appropriate controls. So for level 1, we might have controls A, B, C. For level 2, we might have A, B, D, E. So you're going to look at individual levels and you will select the appropriate control. That means if it's secret, top secret, whatever the case may be, you're going to have the appropriate controls based off of the nature of the object in that category. Step 3 is the actual implementation of said controls, and you're going to notice that's part of the SP 870, meaning as we look at certain controls, we're going to have to look at how to properly implement them. Not just implement, but are we going to be able to audit? We're going to be able to verify. How are these controls actually employed within the system, including the environment of operation? After that, we have our step 4, assess, part of the SP 853, and that's also going to be tied to an assessment report. But our assessment is basically looking at the organization's need to assess appropriate controls and the appropriate assessment procedures that are required for those controls. It is also determined at this level to the extent to which the controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the appropriate outcomes with respect to meeting security needs. That means also then verifying that everything is appropriate. After we've implemented and assessed the implemented security controls, we have the authorization, part of the SP 837, and that's authorizing the management system for official authorizes the system to operate or continue to operate based off of the results of the assessment. The assessment will drive what areas are truly properly secured, and once we've done that, we can then verify and then continue to operate those informational systems. This decision is based off of the determination of risk to the organization's operations, assets resulting from the operation of those systems, and the determination that the risk is acceptable based off of previous findings, both implementation and assessment, in accordance with our risk assessment report. This will also then help deliver a plan of action, thus allowing for a certain level of controls to be dictated by that plan of action. If we found that we implemented a control and we assess that control and maybe it is okay, maybe it's a little weak, but still within our tolerance, so we authorize it. However, we develop a plan of action to get that weaker control that was appropriately assessed to a stronger level. The plan of action just allows us to step up what we are already doing. And lastly is our monitoring, and that's going to be the SP 800-137. Oh, went too far. That's this guy right here. Monitoring, and you're going to need notice you're going to have to repeat the steps as necessary. And part of the monitoring section is just that. You have to continuously monitor the security controls. Part of this is to ensure that they are effective over time as technology changes and as systems grow more complex. You need to make sure that the control that you implemented is still producing the appropriate results that you were expecting. And that again, this includes assessing controls effectiveness, documenting changes to the systems or the environment, conducting impact analysis, at the associate changes, reporting security states to the appropriate designated official, and then repeating as necessary. So again, this is a circle, this is a flow, and as you go through each one, as you finish, you rinse and repeat. You're going to notice that a lot of this is all about involving the life cycle to develop the appropriate controls for organizing the categorization of our information. So one of the inputs is architectural considerations. These considerations include what information security architecture requirements, and that includes subunits, and that also would include the overall structure of the entire enterprise, security processes, systems, personnel, and how they align with the appropriate mission and strategic goals of the overall organization. The organization has to be able to do business, so the security architecture has to align. Business and mission process, again, this refers to the organization, what they do and how they do it, what they perceive the mission is, what the mission actually is stated, and what business processes are fulfilled within meeting that mission or goal. Again, the vision for long-term within that organization, there has to be alignment of the categorization of those informational objects. Lastly, boundaries. There needs to be boundaries for authorized boundaries to establish the scope of protection of that information. That will include people's processes, technologies, other informational objects that are part of the organization's mission and business process. A huge part here is you need to be able to define what the scope of each of those objects are, so you can have the appropriate control in place to protect those items. Without clear boundaries, there is clearly not a separation of who controls what. Thus, that could lead to security gaps. At the end of the day, business alignment with IT and security has to be there. If you make a business so secure but they're not able to perform their functions, guess what? The business doesn't stay in business. The business's job is to make a profit. However, that means its protections have to align with what they're trying to accomplish. If things are not aligned, then they're wasting certain resources. So there are other major types of inputs for the categorization and organization of items. That includes things like laws, directives, policies, procedures, guidelines, guidance. That also includes things like strategic goals and objectives. So this is going to be based off of the organization. So strategic, this is going to be goals from the organization. The priorities and the resource availability, that's going to be things like budget and management priorities based off of vision. Again, vision of the organization. Lastly, is a big one, supply chain. Are you able to get the resources you need to accomplish the things that you're trying to do? And so here, resource management through supply chain considerations is huge. Doesn't matter if you have, hundreds of thousands of dollars of a specific item that is on the way. If you don't have it, it makes it really hard to sell. And again, that is based off of assuming you have a product that you're selling. The supply chain is the ability to take items that you have and be able to transport them to your customers. So all of this has to align. Here we have some other interrelated concepts, also essential. Information type. So again, this is going to be categorization of information. That could be that are outlined by laws or directives. I take care of a law firm, for example. They actually have specific guidance that relates directly to client information. So anything that we tag as client information has to have a certain level of protection, where other PII has a different classification, so that they have other forms of protection. You also have a security objective, and again, based off of the information type categorization or classification, you may have a different level of security objective based off of that object. Each object is also going to have an impact. If there's a breach for a specific type of information type, what is the impact to the overall organization? That again will be classified as the impact level. For example, if you have client information and a data breach, and the data breach is able to breach that client information, what is the impact of that for the overall organization? So these are kind of important, and the impact, if it's high enough, could do some serious damage. Lastly is the security classification, and this is the grouping of information into classes that reflect the value to the organization of that information. And again, that's the security categorization. And sometimes you can group these into like areas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is their key level of protection. Each information type needs to have a security objective and an impact analysis done on them to help determine the appropriate security classification. All right, so this holds true for categorization. What about classification? And classification basically provides people who deal with the information with a very specific, concise indication of how to handle and protect that information. That means if you are given a specific piece of an object and it has a classification, that classification dictates what do you do with it. And there are very specific approaches based off of the standard bodies. For example, ISO 27001 indicates that information to be classified in terms of legal requirements. That could also be value, to criticality, and sensitivity to unauthorized disclosure as outlined by 27002. There are codes of practice that outline what you're supposed to be doing with this. Within the FIPS standard for security categorization of federal information and informational systems, they provide a more precise definition of security categorization, specifying the following generalized format. The information type is based off of the confidentiality, impact, and the integrity, and the availability of said piece of information. There are structures here to ensure that classification is done properly. And we do have a coming up in a little later chapter, chapter 5, people management, we do actually have a more of a descriptive set of terms to distinguish between the critical and sensitive information that we'll discuss in a slightly different chapter. So again, here is our security categorization process. First thing we do is we identify the information type. We then select the appropriate impact levels. We review the impact levels, repeat if necessary. Once we have finalized the impact level, we can adjust and finalize. Once we have adjusted and finalized, we can then assign the controls. That then dictates the security categorization and then the security control selection. And you'll notice as we go through this, we may have to go through this for each individual type of informational data types or informational objects. But that way you can ensure a certain level of standardization of impact levels across the board. So once you've done the categorization, you can find tips to how to define and identify types of information. According to NIST 860, first step is once we've categorized a process, we need to look at the level of detail, granularity, and look at what governance requirements are there. The results of this step should be information taxonomy or catalog of information types. This information must cover things like electronic types of communication, consistent of transmitted data, processed data, electronic communication, emails, texts, spoken communication via technology, could be a VoIP or Skype or teleconference, multimedia forms of information, as well as physical pieces of information. All of this has to be there. These different classifications allow us to put the appropriate control. For example, physical forms of communication will have a different type of control than an email, for example. Another item that the 860 outlines are 3 steps that are more suggestions for information types. Is it mission-based, service delivery, or back office support? So for the mission area, this area will encompass types of information that is related specifically to the mission of the organization. An example is organizational healthcare, has information on what healthcare delivery services provide, fees, schedule, insurance arrangement, things like that, as well as technology companies that support that information about the research, development, plans, goals, consulting, and things of that nature. Service delivery support, these are types of information that support the operation of the organization and related specifically to services or products offered by the organization. An example is the area of risk management. Mitigation information includes contingency planning, continuity development, continuity of operations, and recovery. Lastly are the back office support functions. These areas support activities that enable the organization to operate effectively. There are 5 main categories within the back office support: administrative management, financial management, HR, information, and technology-based management. An example of information could be how we classify things in confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Whatever the classification scheme of the organization uses, it needs to have clear definitions of the various classification levels so that all those involved classifying the information understand what to do. A useful tool in the appropriate context is the Business Impact Reference Table, or BIRT. We found this in Chapter 3 in our Information Risk Assessment field, which does provide consistent definitions of different types of impacts and severity levels based off of your classification. So that means things like selecting and reviewing the impact levels is important. Again, according to the 860, the second step of security categorization is assigning the impact levels. The third step is simply reviewing the impact levels. You need to be able to look at, again, how it relates to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and we need to be able to add the impact level. Medium, low, high, critical. Again, it really just depends on how we want how to do this, but we need to assign and review the appropriate levels. That allows us to classify, categorize, and then review the appropriate impact levels of said objects. So once we do that, the final step of security categorization is to assign security classifications for each type. If the scheme suggests overall classification of types corresponding to the assessed impacts, the highest of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability impact will have the higher level security classification. Otherwise, you map them to the classification scheme. Naming of each classification level is important, gives additional context. An important consideration is the naming of each classification level. The name should make sense in the context of the classification scheme. Classifying information types and properly naming them provides people who deal with the information with a concise indication of how to handle each level. Essentially, if we are categorizing them, level 1, level 2, level 3, we would then have to define how we are organizing them. That way, the individuals that are reviewing it have the ability to understand quickly what those levels mean. So after we have done these steps, we rinse and repeat. This is a process development, and we need to monitor and develop as necessary. There are multiple ways to do data collection and monitoring. RFID is definitely one of them as a data collection technology that uses electronic tags. That way you can tag certain pieces of information that are classified a certain way. So if they leave a file cabinet or if they leave a room, for example, they could then be followed or they might be alerted. So again, the tags might have some type of radio frequency chip that would then alert when removed out of a certain area. Labeling needs to be associated with each instance of an information type so that its classification is clearly and unambiguously known. For certain types of tagging, this is crucial. Methods are also needing to ensure that the labeling is not separated from the information, that the content of the label is secured from unauthorized modification. For example, for certain types of protected information for printed material for the law firm I work with, we stamp each document. That way, even if you try to duplicate it, it can't be duplicated. We do a watermark built into it as well. And then for super sensitive pieces of information, we have RFID tags that are attached to them, and there is a RFID reader outside of our library system. That way, or our record and library area. That way, if you take a file outside of the area and it is coded as highly sensitive, it will then set off an alert. There are other forms of information labeling. For physical information types, you could sort the physical labels. There should also be an RFID tag attached to the object when appropriate. For information stored electronically, again, you can do appropriate electronic tags. That could be watermarking, labeling headers, embedding metadata, and having a digital rights management system, and also looking at appropriate digital protections so that things cannot be modified, altered, transmitted outside the network, and so forth. Digital signatures can also be used for electronic communications for non-repudiation. So part of that also would then deal with the data loss prevention. So these DLP-based tools are not just policies or procedures or guidelines. They're not just logs and reports or tags, encryption and decryption of data, but a combination of all of it. It is a set of technologies and inspection technologies used to review the classification and the content contained within each object to ensure that the object or data is not lost or mishandled. Information handling does refer to a specific process of storing, communicating, and handling based off of the classification of said information. ISO 27002 does list very specific guidelines, access restrictions, maintenance that include audits, protection, storage, and clearing the marked of data, being able to watermark them, for example, so that unauthorized recipients cannot actually view said material. This includes, whenever possible, automating the tools, normally some form of digital rights management or digital management systems in conjunction with a records management system, so that data actually has specific controls put into place, so only those authorized can actually view said material. The automation should also facilitate the integration with security management tools like encryption and digital signatures. If you're using SharePoint with Office 365 with the appropriate security bundles, a lot of this is actually bundled in, oftentimes not managed correctly, but these tools are actually there to aid security managers and security management teams to ensure that the digital management and digital rights management systems all function correctly. So what does this mean? Essentially, whenever possible, use automated tools to enforce the proper handling of information based on classification level. They can be special purpose tools that allow for labeling information more easily, correctly, and consistently. They also bind classification details of information using metadata or other parameter data, communicate their protection requirements effectively through policies and procedures of the organization, and all of this are pretty much built into most file servers already. You have the ability to do this with a file server as well as controls through like Microsoft Server 2016, 19, 22, and so forth. All of them actually have these DLP options built in. Microsoft Office through SharePoint have a lot of these features built in. You just have to have support staff that are knowledgeable enough to implement and use them. The next area is privacy. The ISO 7498-2 OSI, using the basic reference model, defines security architecture looking at privacy as the right of individuals to control or influence what information related to them may be collected, stored, and by whom to that information it may be disclosed. The National Research Council reports at the nexus of cybersecurity and public policy indicates the context of information. The term privacy usually refers to making obtains private information about an individual unavailable to parties who should not have access. What is really interesting is we are seeing more international laws as well as state-based laws specifically dealing with individuals' right to privacy through the EU's GDPR and the California Privacy Protection Act for California-based citizens, and then individual states are also now developing their own laws lining up to very similar to what California has on privacy laws dealing with California-based citizens in the U.S. In the context of cybersecurity, the privacy of that PII information, and that could include name, aliases, address information, PINs, social security numbers, identifying characteristic numbers, telephone numbers, personal characteristics or photographs, anything that contains your likeness, identifying personally owned property, vehicle registration, title, address, rental agreements, all of that. All of this information that is linked or linkable to one of the together, that can piece together what an individual is. All of that is kind of private. So what does that mean? That means our privacy concerns, as a byproduct of all of the pieces of information about individuals that are out there, as well as the collection of security concerns based off of all of the data that is being collected, allow us to define our security of PII. So that means our security concerns, as it overlaps to our privacy concerns, that defines what level of appropriateness we are giving to our security of PII. So we need to understand the purpose of transparency, what PII is being collected, or to which changes in the use of PII are being permitted based off the organizations and based off of who authorized personnel, who's conducting the activities. Also, given that these materials distinctions in the discipline, it should also be clear and which agencies, which stakeholders, which custodians have the ability to effectively manage privacy. However, oftentimes it's not a single entity, and so the privacy solely based off of the managing of security isn't there. We need to have a collection of privacy concerns as the intersection with security concerns. That is where we can define to a certainty the level of protection that is needed for that PII. So what does that look like? That actually looks like this. Information collection on an individual. So here we have our individual. What information is being collected? So that could be all different types, surveillance, interrogation, that could be other forms of information collection, all types of things. From there, it needs to be processed. So we need to have aggregation, identification, and security, and second use of exclusion. All of those are really there for privacy. And these are threats that first must be identified. Once we have this, we start building a data repository. Once we have our data repository, we have information that could be disseminated, or the data repository might have the ability to detect decision inference for information intrusion, and so we can kick it back to the data subject. So the dissemination might take all information that is collected, reviewed through the repository, and then disseminate it. However, the dissemination based off of the scope is really subjective. If the scope is, for example, with permission, we have the appropriate permission to disseminate. That's perfectly fine. However, what if it's a breach or a improper disclosure or something that can be used for blackmail or distortion? So again, these are all potential for privacy threats. Information is collected and then when not done appropriately can be used against the individual or the data subject. So privacy threats are information collection that's not necessarily harmful, but can in some cases constitute a privacy threat. Two types of threats are surveillance and interrogation. Surveillance-based threats is someone watching, listening, or recording an individual activities, and that is where we get the blackmail or things like that. We also have the interrogation, and this is presuming of an individual to divulge information through pressure. Other threats could be aggregation, and again, the aggregation of data is through individuals in various databases, so collecting mass amounts of data on an individual and aggregating all of that information together to see a bigger picture about an individual. Identification, and that is with sufficient data, you can be able to gain a much broader picture of an individual if it is all aggregated together. Insecurity, that's improper protection of handling of PII. Secondary use is again information about a person obtained through one purpose that can be then used for other purposes when consent may not necessarily be given. And we also have the exclusion, and this is the failure to provide individuals with notice and input about their individual records. That's why things like GDPR and California Protection Act actually outlaw this type of data collection, and then have outlined how that failures to notify and protect individual records or even provide the process to allow individuals to have their data scrubbed illegal. So there are states and there are industries and there are countries that are starting to look at how individual data is used and then looking at how to better protect that information. So privacy threats, again, threats specifically for disclosure are disclosure of that information that's private, breach of confidentiality, exposure, blackmail, or other forms when disseminated when not given permission. So privacy threats also are that disclosure, breach of confidentiality, and exposure. The disclosure is, again, releasing true information about a person that might be harmful. Breach of confidentiality normally defines a breach as disclosure that involves the violation of trust. Exposure will involve the exposure to others of certain physical and emotional attributes of an individual that was meant to be kept private. Increased accessibility, basically information that is already publicly available, but it's made easier to access. Blackmail, again, involves the threatening of disclosure of information. Appropriation is involving the use of personal identifiable and personality of that person for another. Distortion is the manipulation of the way a person is perceived and judged by others. And again, all of this goes back to the intrusion and decisional interference. So the fourth area for privacy is known as invasion, and the invasion does involve implementing directly on the individual. Intrusion, incursion into the personal life or into that personal space. Decisional interference is the broad legal concept that involves the individual's interest in avoiding certain types of disclosure to the extent that certain actions might generate data that could potentially be disclosed based off of the decisions to perform specific actions. The interesting thing is we're talking about privacy principles and policies. There's a number of international organizations, governments, and other industry bodies that have introduced standards, laws, and regulations intended to protect individuals' privacies. Again, we've already talked about things like the GDPR for the EU, and within the US, we have states like California Privacy and Protection Act that is also growing. There are some national and international frameworks. ISO 29100, the privacy framework, is one of them. They list 11 key areas for privacy, and those areas include consent and choice, enable PII principles. The person whom the PII relates to exercise consent to the use and provides an opt-in, opt-out based choice. The purpose for legitimacy and specification defines the purpose for which the PII can be used with clear specifications to the PII principles. Collection limitation, which will limit the collection of PII to which is within the boundaries of applicable laws and strictly necessary for specific purposes. Data minimalization minimizes the process of the PII. Use, retention, and disclosure limitations that will limit the use, retention, and disclosure, as well as transfer of the PII to which is necessary in order to fulfill the specific, explicit, and legitimate purposes. Accuracy and quality will ensure that PII is accurate and obtained from a reliable and verified source, and provide periodic checks of information integrity. Next is openness, transparency, and notices, which will provide PII principles with clear and easy accessible information about PII controller policies, procedures, guidelines, practices within respect to the processing of that PII. Individual participation and access gives the PII principles the ability to access their own PII, challenge its accuracy, and provide amendments or removal requests. Accountability adopts concrete and practical measures for PII protection. Information security protects the PII under authority which appropriate controls and operations, functional and strategic levels to ensure that the integrity, confidentiality, and availability of that PII and the products it's used against has a minimal risk, such as unauthorized access, destruction, use, modification, disclosures, or loss. Lastly, we have the privacy compliance requirements, which will verify and demonstrate the process meets data protection and privacy safeguard requirements by periodically conducting audits using internal and external auditor reviews or trusted third-party auditors for verification. So there are policies, there are guidelines, there are structures for how all of this is put together. So there are international groups, again, like the EU with GDPR, that outline very similar standards. Here we have the principles for the EU GDPR: fair, lawful, and transparent processing, purpose of limitations, data minimalization, accuracy, data retention periods, data security, and accountability. Again, you're going to notice these common themes as we're talking about privacy protection for the individual user. And these types of standards are still being honed. So here we have the EU's GDPR. So we have one of the most comprehensive initiatives for our General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR. And again, this applies to all companies worldwide that have any interactions with EU citizens. And that means it has widened the definition of personal data compared to previous regulations. The interesting part is it tightens the rules for obtaining valid consent for PII. It also requires public authorities to process PII to appoint data protection officers as well as other entities. GDPR does mandate protection impact assessments. GDPR also requires organizations to notify local data protection authorities of a data breach within an appropriate time frame. 72 hours is typical. GDPR also introduces the right to be forgotten, meaning you as an EU citizen could come and say, I want to have my data scrubbed. And then the individual will have to, the company will have to scrub that individual's data. And again, the California Protection Act is very similar in a lot of these regards. They all deal with individual privacy of PII, and a lot of them carry across. Like the California Act actually, again, allows for impact assessment, allows for heavy data regulations for California citizens outside the state of California, data breach notifications, as well as privacy controls, as well as the right to be forgotten. That also includes right to amend any misinformed or inaccurate data sets. One of the big things that GDPR really pushed for was tightening the rules for obtaining valid consent for PII, meaning having the ability to prove valid consent for use of PII is likely to be one of the biggest challenges presented to the GDPR. The GDPR states the consent of the data subject means any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indications of his or her wishes by which the data is subject, either by statement or by clear affirmative action, signifies agreements to use of that PII related to being processed. Again, these are rules that are still growing and still being reshaped. Here we have U.S. privacy laws and regulations. You're going to notice a lot of them are fairly old. We have things like the Privacy Act of 1974, which that specifies federal agencies must follow specific rules for collecting, use, transfer, and disclosure of individuals' PII. We have the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction of 2003, the FACTA, requires entities engaged in certain kinds of consumer financial transactions to be aware of the warning signs of identity theft. We have HIPAA of 1996, that normally gears towards medical and provides appropriate protections for health privacy. We have FERPA, Family Education Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, is designed to protect students and their families for privacy of student educational records. We have the Graham-Lee Beeler Act, or the GLBA of 1999, imposes privacy and information security provisions on financial institutions, again, geared towards protecting financial data of consumers. We have the Federal Policy for Protection of Human Subjects, outlines the basic ethical principles in research involving human subjects. We have the Children Online Privacy Act, COPPA, governs the online collection of personally identifiable information for anyone under the age of 13. We also have the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Generally prohibits unauthorized and intentional interception of wire and electronic communications during the transmission phase, and unauthorized access to electronically stored wire or electronic communications. And again, this is not a be-all, end-all type list. This is just a very small, modern-day list of acts directly dealing with privacy within the U.S. This directly feeds into what are some of the privacy controls. And privacy controls include things such as encountering privacy threats and identifying them and complying with, again, local regulations, laws, torts, industry standards, things of that nature, that all set the privacy controls. So far in this section, we've looked at the potential threats to privacy and a broad approach to government regulation as a privacy. To counter privacy threats and comply with government laws and regulations, organizations need a set of privacy controls that will encompass their privacy requirements. Such controls can be found in the NIST SP 853, Recommended Security Controls for Federal Information Systems and Organizations. This set is organized into 8 families with a total of 24 controls. So we have the authority and purpose. This family ensures that organizations identified in the legal basis that are authorized in particular to PII collection or activities that impact privacy and specifics in their noticing of the purpose of which PII is collected. These controls would embody a policy statement. Second would be the data quality and integrity. The objective of this family is to ensure that any PII collected and maintained by organization is accurate, relevant, timely, and complete in the purpose for which it is being used for. This control will include procedures for confirming to the greatest extent possible the quality of the PII collected or created and documenting the process to ensure integrity. 3 would be the accountability, audits, and risk management. This family consists of controls for governing, monitoring, risk management, and assessments to demonstrate that organizations are complying with applicable privacy protection requirements and minimizing overall privacy risks. It includes things such as the Privacy and Governance Program, Privacy Impact and Risk Assessment, privacy requirements for contractors and service providers, and that includes establishing and including contract privacy responsibilities, privacy monitoring and auditing, that involves monitoring and auditing privacy controls and internal privacy policies to ensure effective implementation, privacy awareness and training, this involves implementing awareness programs for all employees, privacy reporting, this involves developing any mandated privacy reports for any type of regulatory bodies, privacy enhanced system design and development, this involves designing information systems to support privacy by automating privacy controls. Lastly, accounting of disclosure. This involves keeping an accurate accounting of disclosures and making it available to any person affected. Number 4 would be data minimalization and retention. These consist of several additional controls, things like minimizing of PII. This would involve establishing procedures to identify the minimal relevant and necessary PII for a specific task. Data retention and disposal. This will involve retaining PII only as long as necessary and providing secure methods of deletion and destruction and verifying both deletion and destruction. Third would be minimization of PII used in testing, training, and research. This involves developing and implementing policies and procedures to minimize the use of PII in testing, training, and research. After that, we have number 5, individual participations and readiness, and they consist of several things. This family addresses the need to make individual activity participants in the decision-making process regarding the collection, use of PII, and it includes consent. This will involve providing means where feasible and appropriate. Individual access. This involves providing individuals with the ability to have access to their own PII. Readiness. This will involve providing a process by which an individual can have inaccurate PII corrected. Complaint management, this will involve implementing a process for receiving and responding to complaints, concerns, or questions from an individual about the organization or privacy practices. Number 6 would be security. In this family, we ensure technical, physical, and administrative safeguards are in place to protect PII, collected or maintained by an organization against loss, unauthorized access, or disclosure. These controls are meant to supplement the organization's security controls that may be relevant to privacy, including the maintenance of inventory of PII, as well as developing a privacy incident response plan. Number 7 is transparency. This family ensures that organizations provide public notice of their information practices and privacy impact to their organizations and activities. This will include procedures for notifying individuals of the status of their PII and dissemination of any PII privacy program information. Number 8 is use limitation. This family ensures the scope of the PII is used to limit to the extended purpose, and that is it. This will include developing policies and procedures to limit the internal access to PII to only those who require and are authorized to access it, as well as similar policies and procedures for third parties outside the organization to limit interaction with that data. One of the important ones here is the awareness. So with respect to awareness and training, there is also the NIST 800-122 Guides to Protecting Confidentiality of PII, suggested covering the following topics, things like definition of PII, applicable laws, regulations, policies, guidelines, restrictions of data processing, collection, storage, transmitting, processing of PII, roles and responsibilities, retention and disposal / destruction, misuse, recognition of incidences involving both security and or privacy, dealing directly with PII, again, retention, role and responsibilities in responding to incidences and reporting for both internal and external auditing bodies as they relate to PII. So there's a lot of privacy controls that are already out there that need to be tweaked and then implemented. So there's also the documents and record management. So the document is going to be a set of information pertaining to a specific structure, topic, a human, something. The record is a subclass of document that clearly delineates the terms and conditions, statements, or claims that provides an official record. So records are more official, where a document is just a set of information pertaining to a topic. There is a structure for document management. That's the capture and management of the document within the organization. A document management system, that's the software to manage the documentation. There is a records management tool, and that's the creation, retention, and scheduling, destruction of an organization's PII or sensitive or important paper and electronic record types. There's also a record management system, which is a software tool for aiding in that record management section. Here are some of the differences between documents and records. So, purpose for the document, make it easier for users with a shared purpose to access and manage documents. Within the records, it's concerned with identifying, storing, and maintaining and managing data that is used to describe an event. Storage for document includes the ability to access, revise, and deal with tracking the historical components of documents, where with records, that is intended to keep records within the original format and content. For security, that provides access controls by means of tracking who is using the document, where within records management, it provides more of a stringent security, including authentication and data integrity, and then disposal of documents in a document management that will occur through a life cycle of the document. For records keeping, it's the destruction of records and generally regulated by laws with very strict procedures. There's also roles that documents play. So, for example, the record or a document are contracts and agreements. There's policies, procedures, standards, guidelines. There could be creating an image or impression. There are generating revenue or reports, revenues by adding value, mechanism for communications, acts of vehicle maintenance, vehicle auditing, or to provide discipline of captured articulations of concepts and ideas. So there's a ton of different types of roles different documents can play based off of what they are. There's also life cycles for dealing with this, and that normally means capturing the document that's from various sources and placing them within the document management system. Classifying it, that's classifying the document to give it a business context and to allow metadata to be assigned. Distribute allows documents to continue through the life cycle, gathering additional information to be reviewed and approved as necessary. Manage represents the documentation for the users through the various interfaces and applications to make the delivery as seamless as possible. Retain, keep the document for a period defined in the classification before archiving or destruction. These areas keep going in a circle. They are circular in nature. In other areas, organizations should develop acceptable use policies and awareness programs with respect to documentation through the life cycle to ensure the capture, classification, the distribution, managing, retention, and destruction of said documents. There's also a record variation of this. So to develop the guidelines for securing records include developing a clear and detailed policy that defines what documents should be classified as records, store only a single instance of the document, whether it's physical or electrical, define access restrictions as tightly as reasonable, monitor each record to ensure compliance within the organization's record retention policy, and ensure secure destruction of a record or secured archival of a record when the retention period has been expired. So when we get to the disposal portion, the disposal will either destroy or archive based off of whatever criteria that needs to be set. As we dive further into record management, there are very specific guidelines for Higher Education Information Security Council suggests very specific controls. Establishing a strategic plan, writing communication directives, identifying record management, write policy statements, responsibilities, objectives, and so on, automate record management, determine staff and organization requirements, conduct a preliminary file purge, complete a records inventory, develop and implement a retention schedule, protect vital records, develop record management manual, and have appropriate policies, procedures, and guidelines, implement filling standards throughout the organization, identify a process for managing interactive records in a low-cost space, and implement form management and reporting management programs to ensure proper record management. So, the life cycle of record management distinguishes three main stages: active, semi-active, and inactive. An active record is currently being used to support the organization. Semi-active are records that are no longer needed to carry out current activities, but must still be retained. Maybe fiscal or legal or historical record requirements. Inactive are things that are no longer required and no longer need to be there. There is no requirement. There's no legal requirement or historical requirement that exists anymore. Sensitive physical information. So sensitive information held on physical form, so needs to be properly protected against corruption, loss, and unauthorized disclosure. This could be blank checks, bonds, printouts, financial projections, business plans, anything that is PII related or business related that is physical. COBIT 5 summarizes the requirements of protecting of sensitive physical information as providing adequate, specific information, secure measures for data and information that exists in a non-digital form, including documents, media facilities, physical perimeters, and transmutation of said information. Key issues involved with securing physical information throughout the life cycle includes identifying the documents, classifying the documents, labeling, storage, secure transportation, and disposal and destruction of said physical documents. Secure transportation is actually who's authorized to take them And how are they taking them? Are they storing them in a locked box, putting them in a company vehicle and then driving them somewhere? Or what structure for transportation of those documents are best? And there are NIST standards for defining physical sensitive information. Lastly is information management best practices. The area basically is information classification and privacy. You have to classify and make it appropriate for handling. You need to have information privacy controls in place. You have to have information protection, document management, and sensitive physical information management all needs to be present. So all of this is geared towards protecting of information, specifically around PII, looking at different lenses through how that PII might be accessed and what controls are needing to be placed for protection of that PII from the consumer's perspective, as well as the requirements or the duties as the organizations holding that PII. All right, that is it for this chapter. We looked at explaining the steps for information classification, information labeling, requirements for labeling, overview of threats and privacies. We looked at some of the common GDPR protections. We looked at differences between documents and records, looked at an overview consideration for sensitive physical information, as well as information management best practices. That is all I had for this chapter. Thank you. So this concludes our lecture review on this book. Questions, concerns, or thoughts? Leave a comment, make a statement, get a hold of me. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Remember that when we do some of this, it is critical that we ensure that we're answering your questions. Don't just listen and don't try to apply. Listen, try to apply what we've been discussing, and when possible, if you're not understanding something, say something.